Okay, so jokes aside, this gun is a lot more straightforward than the other Season 2 weapons. Point at bugs, press M1, bugs die. The only real questions with this thing have to do with how it compares to other weapons. But as a baseline, we should look over how it works. Shard Diffractor shoots a straight hit scan beam that does both direct damage and area damage in a small AoE around the point of impact. Both the direct and area damage are split between 75% disintegrate and 25% fire. It also innately inflicts heat equal to 25% of the damage done, which can be increased to 100% with a mod. There's a small wind-up time of 0.25 seconds before it actually starts firing, and once you're firing, your move speed is reduced. It fires until either the battery is depleted or the gamer at the keyboard lets go of M1, at which point the battery starts to automatically recharge from your reserve ammo, whether the gun is still equipped or not. The recharge speed is shown on the stats screen, and the time it takes to recharge is mostly unchanged by ammo consumption. If the battery is fully drained, the time it takes to get back to full is only very slightly longer than the time it takes to recover from a partially drained battery. I don't think that's supposed to happen, but also you probably shouldn't really worry about it. Once the battery starts recharging, you can't fire until it finishes. In general, the base gun has single target DPS that is nice but not amazing. However, it can sustain itself for a while and is extremely accurate. So it's a gun that has wind up and slows you while firing, is accurate at long range, has good sustained single target damage output, and instead of reloading, recovers from shooting over time when you're not shooting it. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, in practice, while this gun is directly competing with PGL and Breach Cutter, without overclocks, the gun that it's most analogous to is the minigun. Not exactly, of course, but at base it sort of occupies a similar niche. Single target sustain with good accuracy. This puts it in kind of an unusual place for an Engie secondary. Normally, they have good burst and crowd control, but bad sustain, and run out of ammo very quickly if you just keep shooting them. A secondary that is relatively weak at swarm clear for Engie, without overclocks anyways, might be an awkward fit for normal Engie builds, but you can definitely find room for a minigun-esque weapon in Engie's secondary slot. Not to mention, most of the overclocks are pretty transformative, but we'll get to that in a bit. Let's say you're using it without overclocks. You can improve how well it works against crowds with the AoE size and damage mods, as well as Tier 5B, which refunds 3 ammo to the battery whenever you kill a bug with it. Tiny enemies not included. It won't be quite as good at it as PGL or Breach Cutter, but it'll get the job done alright, while still having nice sustained single target damage. Alternatively, you can lean into that single target damage with the Tier 2 weak point damage mod, Tier 5A, which adds plus 33% damage against electrified enemies, and possibly also the Tier 1 damage mod instead of ammo. Tier 5A, like most other damage boosts against an enemy with a status effect, inflicts the extra damage with the same damage type that the status inflicts, so in this case, electric damage. If you do this, you'll want to bolster your swarm clear with damaging grenades, probably plasma bursters, and likely also a primary that helps out with crowds. An electric build Stubby can do this, and so can Crowd Clear Loki, explosive chemical rounds being my recommendation. Turret Whip Warthog can also provide that support, but if you go that route, you'll likely want to swap out Tier 5A for Tier 5C since your primary isn't enabling the electric bonus anymore. Or at least, that's what I would say if Dazzler Module was working. It's supposed to inflict an 80% slow, but right now it doesn't seem to do anything at all. So I guess you might as well run Tier 5A on single target shard builds even if you don't have a primary that inflicts electricity, because your teammates still might, or at least use Tier 5B. Until this is fixed, this mod just doesn't function. The Tier 3 mods are pretty much just personal preference, but I find the charge speed to be a bit more flexible. However you're building Shard Diffractor, I'd recommend taking the Tier 4 Heat mod instead of the Armor Break mod. It turns your heat inflicted from 25% of damage done to 100% of damage done, which is a pretty substantial amount. Not that the Armor Break is terrible or anything, but inflicting a lot more heat makes overheating robots pretty easy, and there's always a chance of robots showing up and ruining your picnic. Obviously, there's more granularity in build choice than I'm showing here. There's a lot of worthwhile combos you can use with this thing, and we'd be here all day if I tried to cover every permutation. But that's the general gist of this gun. You either lean into the single target damage, or you increase the area effectiveness and turn it into a jack-of-all-trades. So, what about overclocks? Let's start with a popular one that leans really hard into damage output: Overdrive. Now, this overclock is one of those unstables that is secretly a clean. The downside only happens when you use the special effect after all. Whenever you're firing, you can press R to boost your beam. Doing this does 4 things. Your beam now does 2.5x damage per hit in both direct and area damage. Your beam now consumes 2 ammo per instance of damage instead of 1. You can't move at all while firing, and your beam keeps shooting until drained, even if you let go of M1. If you switch weapons, you can cancel the beam, but if you do this, you lose ammo equal to 50% of your charge capacity, and the battery will need to recharge from 0. So you don't normally want to cancel it unless it's urgent. So Overdrive wants you to really commit to a burst. In exchange, it does damage very quickly, and also somewhat more ammo efficiently. Of course, if your target dies before the burst is over, you're losing some of that ammo efficiency. Potentially quite a lot if you can't transfer to a new target quickly. This means that taking increased battery size is kind of risky, because if you lock yourself into a big burst, you can end up wasting ammo. The recharge speed mod is a lot more flexible with Overdrive as a result. You'll shoot in shorter bursts, but more frequently, and the damage you do in a burst is still high enough to melt important targets. You can take AoE mods with this, but the rate that it burns ammo means that those mods are mostly just useful when not overdriving. You might want that. Your overdrive will be weaker, but some people will find regular firing that is better against groups more comfortable. However, I personally like to go full single target damage on overdrive, ideally with either Stubby or Loki to enable Tier 5A. The most important comparisons here are comparing this with Breach Cutter and Hyperpropellant PGL. All 3 of these options will kill tanky targets fast enough that you don't really need to split hairs over the killing speed. The meaningful differences come in efficiency and utility. Overdrive is, against most single tanky targets, the most ammo efficient option you have. It's also way more flexible than Hyperprop because you can fire without overdriving to shoot squishy targets without wasting ammo. And it's good at overheating all kinds of bots. Hyperprop is good against patrol bots, but it's wasteful against turrets. Hyperprop has the advantage of smashing frozen targets. Shard Diffractor thaws them, which is quite bad against tanky enemies, and Breach Cutter just doesn't benefit from the frozen status at all. Also, against really good weak points, Hyperprop gets a bit of an edge as well. Breach Cutter is less ammo efficient against single enemies, but it gets to cleave through multiple targets. This means that not only is it the best, period, if there's multiple tanky enemies, but also that it can deal with both big boys and swarms at the same time. Anytime a Praetorian is right next to a bunch of grunts, it's great for Breach Cutter. However, it's definitely the worst against oppressors because of their resistance to electric and fire damage. The same thing also goes for dreadnoughts, but less extreme. All in all, you end up with 3 options that are all good at single target damage. One of them can also flexibly be used for normal enemies and robots, and is often the most ammo efficient. One of them is great for smashing frozen targets and 3x weak points. And one can mow down swarms alongside big enemies, or multiple big enemies at once. There's reasons to use all of these, and none of them obsoletes the others. Lastly, this is something I've posted about before, but if you take this specific setup, you can overheat Nemesis in one burst. I wouldn't recommend it for general use, for the battery issue mentioned before, as well as tier 1 damage being kind of overkill with this OC, but if you just want to put Nemesis in the ground at all costs, this does it extremely quickly. Make sure to bait out the barrier first, though. Automated Beam Controller shares the can't stop shooting mechanic with Overdrive. However, unlike Overdrive, it's not an alternate firing mode. It always shoots this way, and has 80% of the normal battery capacity, although that may be considered an upside to limit ammo wastefulness. In exchange, you get a good amount of extra ammo and rate of fire, and a small recharge time buff. If you can make your peace with uncontrollable mag dumping, this is a pretty nice overclock if you want to use Diffractor frequently. You wind up with a lot of ammo after all. Aside from that, it's not really biased towards any specific kind of build. That's also true of this gun's only clean overclock, efficiency tweaks. A little more reserve ammo and a little more battery size. There's honestly not much to say about this one. It's very generalist, you can do whatever you like with it. The remaining 3 overclocks, Volatile Impact Reactor, Feedback Loop, and Endothermic Explosion, are all overclocks with unique mechanics that enhance your swarm clearing. I'm going to start with the most complex one first and work forward. That's Volatile Impact Reactor. On paper, Volatile Impact Reactor isn't that messy. When the beam hits the ground, it creates magma that lasts for 7 seconds, inflicts a 0.7x slow, and does 5 fire and 5 heat every 0.1 to 0.15 seconds. That's 40 of both fire damage and heat per second on average. The complex part comes in when comparing this to sticky flames from the Crisper. There's a mechanic I don't think most players are really aware of called environmental heat and cooling sources. Obviously people know that stuff like flame geysers and cold wind vents exist, but they function in kind of an unintuitive way. Environmental temperature sources don't just inflict heat or cold. Instead, they take the normal warming or cooling rates that creatures have and replace them with temperature changes per second based on the intensity value of the source. This means that not only is a creature standing in an environmental heat source having its temperature changed, but it can't actually cool down from the heat at all until it leaves. The same thing is true in reverse with an environmental cooling source. Some player-applied effects count as environmental heat sources, and the sticky flames left by the Crisper are one of them. They have intensity 3, so they replace the creature's cooling rate with plus 20 heat per second. And every single sticky flame puddle will heat creatures within 0.75 meters by 5 per second. Usually this winds up being around 40 per second, but you also have to consider that they are getting rid of the creature's cooling. For creatures that cool quickly, this can make quite a big difference. This is actually why the crisper sticky flames make such a huge difference when overheating Nemesis. As long as the Nemesis is touching them, the fast cooling it has normally is totally disabled. The whole reason I bring this up is that the magma the impact reactor makes does not count as an environmental heat source. This means that, despite sometimes directly inflicting more heat with the ground flames than Crisper does, in actual practice it will sometimes heat enemies slower. Crisper's sticky flames get to completely replace the innate cooling rate of whatever creature's in them with 20 extra heat per second. Impact Reactor's magma doesn't, which can make a big difference versus some enemies. Also, while Crisper sticky flames heat enemies in a small radius around them, enemies need to be standing directly on top of the magma for it to have any effect on them. This is worth mentioning because I've seen the sentiment floating around that Volatile Impact Reactor is a strictly better version of sticky fuel, which isn't really true. It does have the advantage of being attached to a gun that is long range and has good sustained single target damage, but the effect by itself is somewhat weaker. The slow it applies is a lot worse, and it doesn't stop creatures from cooling, and Crisper gets to pierce through enemies, so it can hit them directly while also creating sticky flames underneath them. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, just that it's not really clear-cut between the two. So all of that said, this overclock is very, very strong. There's a couple reasons why. The first is the already mentioned, you get to create a ground hazard that is similar to sticky flames, but with a gun with unlimited range and good single target. The second is that it gives you that advantage while just taking up the overclock slot. So you don't need to spend any of your mod slots on stuff like AoE size or damage. The overclock slot already takes care of clearing swarms of squishy enemies. It helps your battery size, but that's not much of an impediment most of the time, and the AoE size downside might as well not exist for how much it affects you. Now, as usual, you can run this with Stubby or Loki for that electric damage boost, but my actual favorite build for Impact Reactor, and possibly Shard Diffractor period, uses this overclock alongside Cycle Overload Warthog. The thing is, Shard Diffractor can already be used almost like a primary, and that's especially true of Impact Reactor. It handles squishy targets very well and very ammo efficiently, and lets you snipe things at range without issue. In other words, it's amazing at covering for the weaknesses of Cycle Overload Warthog. Since you're handling all those threats with the Diffractor, you can go nuts on up-close big boys with the Warthog without fear of ruining your ammo economy. The end result is an Engie that deals with swarms efficiently and crushes tanky enemies up close. There's not really any situation you don't feel strong at. Next is Feedback Loop. This is the ultimate greed-inducing overclock. Every 1 second that you fire without stopping, your AoE damage increases by 1, and your AoE radius increases by 0.3 meters. If you stop shooting, you lose the bonuses. The penalty is a big ammo hit, but that doesn't mean this can't be efficient, especially with Tier 5B refunding ammo as it melts bugs. The more bugs that come at you, the more value you can get out of this thing. You have to ride the line. If you're too greedy, you'll run dry. But if you're not greedy enough, you won't get good value from it. Good situational awareness is important here. And for good reason. The potential payoff is huge. As one example, here's a clip of me absolutely shredding an Omen with this thing. that doesn't sell it, I don't know what will. Lastly, Endothermic Explosion. In exchange for a small ammo penalty and a moderate recharge penalty, you get two different effects when shooting platforms. The first extremely good effect is that when your beam hits a platform, the AoE damage and radius are both doubled. That's right, doubled. The second effect, which is sort of its own drawback, is that shooting the platform for 1.5 seconds straight will blow it up, dealing 400 damage, with falloff, in a 5 meter radius and carving the ground in a 1.5 meter radius. Your own knockoff C4. You should usually consider the explosion a bit of a consolation prize, or at least kind of a situational benefit. Sometimes it's good to do it on purpose, but doubling your AoE damage and radius is really good, and you don't normally want to demolish the platforms that enable that. Instead, try flicking your aim off the platforms or onto bugs every now and then as you shoot, to maintain them for longer. And then, if a juicy enough pack is waltzing up, feel free to explode it. This one is fiddly for sure, but not so much as to make it truly awkward to play. And that's the end of the video. Shoutouts to ants, the glyphids of the real world, for delaying this video by invading my home and laying eggs in my carbon monoxide detector. Enjoy the neurotoxin payload, idiots.